I wasn't supposed to be there that night, lost in the overgrown cemetery on a dare. But when my flashlight caught the worn gravestone, I froze. My name stared back at me, along with tomorrow's date. I didn't believe in curses until I realized the grave might not be empty. The gate creaked as I pushed it open, the sound cutting through the stillness of the night. Behind me, my friend's laughter echoed faintly, distant and distorted. "You won't last 5 minutes in there, Danny," shouted, his voice carrying an edge of mockery. I didn't look back. The cemetery was darker than I'd expected, the moonlight struggling to break through the canopy of gnarled branches overhead. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was clinging to my skin. My flashlight flickered as I moved forward, illuminating rows of crooked gravestones and tangled weeds. I wasn't scared. Not yet. At least that's what I kept telling myself as my footsteps crunched over dead leaves. "Just find the angel statue and get out," I muttered under my breath. But the deeper I went, the quieter everything became. The crickets stopped chirping. Even the wind seemed to die. A faint sound made me freeze, a rustling, like someone moving through the grass. My flashlight darted toward the noise, revealing nothing but shadows. My pulse quickened, and I forced myself to keep walking, my breath coming faster. Then I saw a gravestone leaning at an odd angle, half buried in the overgrown grass. My light swept over the inscription, and my blood ran cold. It was my name. My knees felt weak as my gaze dropped lower, landing on the date beneath it, tomorrow. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The dirt around the grave looked fresh, almost as if it had been dug recently. The air turned colder, and a faint whisper brushed past my ear, too soft to make out, but enough to send shivers down my spine. From the shadows, something moved, and I wasn't sure I was alone anymore. I stumbled out of the cemetery, my flashlight swinging wildly, its beam slicing through the suffocating darkness. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. Behind me, the gravestone with my name seemed to loom larger, its fresh dirt searing into my mind like a brand. "Just a coincidence," I muttered, clenching the flashlight tightly as I made it back to the fence where Danny and the others were waiting. Their laughter faded when they saw me. "What happened, Danny?" I asked, stepping closer, his smirk replaced with concern. "Nothing," I lied, brushing past him. "Let's just go." The walk home felt like a dream or a nightmare. The air carried a biting chill, and every shadow along the quiet streets seemed to stretch toward me, reaching with unseen fingers. I forced myself not to look back, though my neck prickled with the sensation of being watched. Once home, I locked the door behind me, the click of the deadbolt oddly comforting. I told myself it was all a mistake. Names repeat. Dates are coincidences, that's all. But even as I repeated it in my head, the unease wouldn't leave. It clung to me, thick and heavy. Around midnight, the first sign came. A faint scratching sound at my bedroom window, rhythmic and deliberate. I froze in bed, the blanket pulled up to my chin, as the sound grew louder. Scratch, scratch. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crept to the window, my breath shallow. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain. There was nothing there, just the faint glow of the streetlight. But when I turned back to my room, my stomach dropped. On my desk, a piece of paper that hadn't been there before. 4 jagged words scrawled in dark ink. "Tomorrow, it begins." The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that the grave had followed me home. Sleep had been impossible. The message scrawled on the paper haunting my thoughts. By daylight, it was easier to pretend it wasn't real. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just a bad prank. But deep down, I knew. And better. When I stepped outside, the world felt off. The air was unnaturally still, the usual hum of morning life eerily absent. I glanced at my front yard, and my stomach twisted. There, pressed into the soft earth, were footprints. They were deep, larger than any person's, and they circled my house. I hadn't heard anything during the night, but the sight sent a chill through me. Work offered no distraction. My coworkers' voices sounded distant, muffled, like I was hearing them through water. Every time I glanced at my phone, I expected another message to appear. I kept checking. The time, dreading when the sun would set. The weight of inevitability pressed down on me. When I got home that evening, the footprints were gone, but something worse had taken their place. In my backyard, at the edge of the woods, a mound of fresh dirt had appeared. My heart raced as I approached it. The grave was here. I stared at the headstone, my name still etched deep into its surface. The date hadn't changed, it was still tomorrow. The sound of rustling leaves snapped me out of my trance. I spun around, scanning the tree line. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, flickering in and out like something or someone was watching. The whispers started again. Faint but clear, you can't escape. I backed away from the grave, stumbling over my own feet. The ground beneath me felt soft, loose. For a moment, I thought I'd fall through it. And when I looked back at the grave, I swore I saw the dirt shift as if something inside was trying to claw its way out. I ran, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the grave was moving closer. It wasn't just following me, it was waiting. That night, the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. They didn't come from outside this time, they came from within my house. I sat in the living room, every light on, clutching a kitchen knife like it would protect me. The air was thick and stale, the shadows in the corners darker than they should have. They had been. You can't escape, the voice hissed again, low and guttural, curling around my thoughts like smoke. My chest tightened as a faint tapping sound echoed through the house. At first I thought it was the wind, but the pattern was deliberate. Tap, pause, tap, tap. The sound grew louder, shifting locations. First the walls, then the windows, then the floor beneath me. My grip on the knife tightened as I struggled to control my breathing. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. The screen lit up with a text, "It's coming." I didn't recognize the number. The lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they came back on, my blood ran cold. The wall across from me now bore words, scrawled in something dark and wet. "The grave is open." A sharp, cold wind swept through the room, even though every window was shut. The shadows on the walls began to move, writhing like living things. My phone buzzed again, this time with a picture. My backyard, the freshly disturbed grave. But the image was wrong. A figure stood next to the mound, a blurred, skeletal silhouette. I bolted to the window, heart racing, and peeked outside. The grave was empty now, its dirt scattered. Faint, hollow voice whispered from the darkness beyond the trees, "It's waiting for you." The shadows stretched toward me. The house was no longer just my house. It felt alive, groaning and creaking with every breath I took. The shadows moved without cause, stretching like clawed hands across the walls. Every time I glanced toward the windows, I saw movement shapes outside, just beyond the glass, waiting. My phone buzzed on the table again, and I nearly screamed. The screen lit up with another message from the unknown number, midnight. "Come to the grave." "No," I whispered, shaking my head as if the phone could see me. "This isn't real. It's not happening." But it was. The floor beneath me felt unstable, as if the house itself had become untethered. A sudden knock at the door made me jump. Knock, knock, knock. It was slow, deliberate, echoing through the house. My breath hitched as I backed away, clutching the knife I'd picked up earlier. The knock came again, louder this time. "It's time," the voice whispered from the other side, familiar and cold. The lights flickered violently, and the clock chimed. Midnight. My phone buzzed one last time. A new picture appeared, the grave, now completely unearthed, with something crawling out. I turned toward the door, frozen as the handle twisted. The whispers grew louder, filling the room as the shadows surged forward. "You can't run anymore." And then, The door opened. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but the yawning darkness beyond. The whispers swirled around me, louder now, voices overlapping, taunting its time. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the floor as the air grew colder, sharper, biting into my skin. A shadow stretched from the open doorway, long and jagged, reaching toward me like a hand. My breath hitched as the clock on the mantel chimed once more, its hollow echo reverberating through the house. A gust of wind swept in, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. My chest tightened. The grave. I knew I had to go, but every fiber of my being screamed to stay inside, to hide. But hiding wouldn't save me. Deep down, I understood that. The shadow moved closer, creeping up the walls and across the floor. It touched my foot, and a cold so intense it burned shot through me. I gasped, stumbling forward. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. The yard was unrecognizable. The trees swayed unnaturally, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The grave glowed faintly in the distance, the disturbed earth pulsing like a heartbeat. I wanted to turn back, but the whispers wouldn't let me. Come, you belong to us. I stumbled toward the grave, each step heavier than the last. The ground beneath me felt soft, shifting like quicksand. My flashlight flickered, barely holding back the shadows that now moved with purpose. When I reached the grave, my knees buckled, and I fell, landing inches from the jagged hole. It was empty. It was empty. The headstone stood tall, my name etched deep into the stone. Below it, today's date gleamed like freshly cut metal. The earth trembled beneath me, and a sound like nails scraping on stone filled the air. I leaned over the edge, and that's when I saw it. Something was crawling up. Its eyes glowed, empty and endless, its grin wide and unnatural. Its face was mine. It reached out, skeletal fingers clawing at the edge, pulling itself closer. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The last thing I felt was its icy grip around my ankle, dragging me down into the earth. The grave was no longer empty, and neither was I. If you stumbled upon a grave with your name and tomorrow's date, would you try to change your fate or accept the inevitable? Share your thoughts. How far would you go to escape the whispers of the grave? If the grave that calls your name isn't empty, could you resist its pull? What would you do if it started moving closer, step by step? It was supposed to be an uneventful train ride, 2 hours of scrolling on my phone and sipping lukewarm coffee. But when the conductor didn't answer my questions and the passengers sat motionless, staring into nothingness, I realized something wasn't right. That's when I noticed. They weren't breathing. The train rolled into the station with a low, mournful whistle, its metal frame groaning as it came to a halt. I adjusted the strap of my bag, stepping onto the platform as the chilling evening air nipped at my neck. The lights above flickered, casting long, wavering shadows on the cracked concrete. Around me, the platform was oddly deserted for this time of night. A few figures shuffled toward the train doors, their movements sluggish, their faces hidden under the dim light. I hesitated before climbing aboard, the faint scent of iron wafting from the train's interior. Shaking off a strange sense of unease, I stepped inside. The door slid shut behind me with a hiss, sealing me into the dimly lit car. The air was unnaturally cold, and the faint hum of the train's engine filled the silence. I scanned the car, noting the scattered passengers slumped in their seats. A man in a suit stared blankly at the floor, his hands limp in his lap. An elderly woman sat near the window, her face turned away, unmoving. A young girl clutched a stuffed animal tightly to her chest, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Something felt wrong. I slid into a seat near the middle, the worn fabric stiff under me. The train jolted forward, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks echoing in my ears. I glanced around again, unease twisting in my stomach. None of the passengers moved. No one adjusted their position. No one checked their phone. They sat frozen, statues in the faint flickering light. The lights dimmed briefly, and in the window's reflection, I thought I saw the girl's head turn toward me. But when I looked directly at her, she hadn't moved. At least I thought she hadn't. The train rattled along the tracks, its motion steady and relentless, but the silence inside was unbearable. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, unable to shake the unease creeping over me. The other passengers remained disturbingly still. The man in the suit hadn't moved a muscle. The elderly woman by the window sat like a statue, her profile frozen in the dim light. The young girl with the stuffed animal clutched it tighter, her fingers rigid and pale. I tried to focus on my phone, hoping for a distraction, but there was no signal. My battery icon flickered erratically, then went dark, leaving me staring at my own pale reflection in the black screen. The cold air pressed against my skin, and the faint hum of the train's engine sounded more like a low growl now, growing louder in the stillness. I glanced around again, trying to catch someone's eye, anyone's, but none of them looked up. Their heads remained bowed, faces obscured by shadow. My heart thudded harder, the rhythm pounding in my ears. "Excuse me," I said aloud, my voice trembling. It echoed too loudly, the sound unnatural in the oppressive quiet. No one reacted. I stood, my legs shaky, and walked to the man in the suit. "Hey," I said, touching his shoulder lightly. His head lolled to the side, his face slack. But it wasn't the lifelessness that terrified me, it was the fact that he wasn't breathing. My chest tightened as I stumbled back, turning toward the young girl. Her head tilted slightly as I approached, and I froze. Her blank eyes stared past me, unblinking. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. The lights flickered, and for a split second, their reflections in the windows weren't sitting anymore. They were standing, their hollow gazes fixed on me. When the light stabilized, everything was as it had been, silent, still, but the air carried a faint whisper. Now, too soft to understand yet impossible to ignore. It seemed to come from the train itself. I wasn't alone. Hey. And whatever else was here wasn't alive. The train car felt smaller now, like the walls were pressing closer with each passing second. The low hum of the engine had turned into a steady vibration, thrumming through the floor and up into my legs. My breath came in short bursts as I backed into my seat, trying to make myself smaller, invisible. The whispers from the last car hadn't stopped. They were faint but growing louder, curling around the edges of my mind. I clutched my phone, but the screen remained dark, as lifeless as the passengers around me. Their stillness was suffocating. "Stop it," I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. "It's just a bad dream." But it wasn't. The young girl with the stuffed animal hadn't blinked, not once. Her head was still tilted, slightly, her empty eyes pointed in my direction. I forced myself to look away, my gaze darting to the windows. Outside was only darkness now, no lights, no landscape, just an endless void swallowing the train. I had to find the conductor. Someone. Anyone. I forced myself to stand, gripping the back of a seat for support. My legs felt like lead as I stumbled toward the door connecting the cars. The whispers grew, louder as I neared the next car, low and guttural, like dozens of voices layered together. I slid the door open, the metal groaning in protest. The next car was the same. Rows of passengers' heads, bowed, unmoving. The air was colder here, biting at my skin. The whispers had followed me, louder now, filling the space with words I couldn't understand. I turned back toward the door, but the lights flickered. For a brief moment, every passenger was staring directly at me, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. When the light stabilized, they were still again, but I wasn't imagining it anymore. They were watching. The whispers became sharper, clearer, like they were no longer coming from some far-off place but from right beside me. I turned my head slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. The passengers were still as statues, their heads bowed, their hands resting unnaturally still on their laps. But their reflections in the windows told a different story. In the glass, they were moving subtle at first, a slight twitch of a hand or a slow tilt of the head. Then, their movements grew more deliberate. They twisted toward me, their empty eyes glowing faintly, their mouths curling into distorted grins. My heart thundered in my chest as I stumbled backward. "Stay away," I shouted, but my voice barely broke the thick silence. The reflection passengers didn't stop. They rose from their seats, their shadowy forms stretching impossibly tall, pressing against the glass like they wanted to break through. The lights flickered violently, plunging the car into darkness for long, agonizing seconds. When the light returned, the reflections were gone, but the whispers had grown deafening. I turned back toward the aisle, my body trembling, and froze. The shadows along the walls had shifted. They stretched across the ceiling, weaving together into grotesque shapes that rippled and moved like living things. One of them unfurled, long and thin, creeping closer to me with every flicker of the light. I ran. The aisle felt endless as I sprinted toward the next door. The whispers now a chorus of voices shrieking unintelligible words. My feet slipped on the cold, slick floor as the shadows gathered behind me, their forms solidifying into dark, twisted figures. I threw myself into the next car, slamming the door shut behind me. The sound of their whispers seeped through the walls, and the shadows pooled beneath the door, pressing against it like they were trying to squeeze through. I realized then they weren't just shadows. They were part of the train, and they wanted me. The train suddenly jolted, throwing me against the wall. My head throbbed as I tried to steady myself, gasping for breath. The whispers that had followed me were gone, replaced by an eerie silence. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then, the train began to slow. I looked out the window, but there was nothing, just endless blackness stretching in every direction. The wheels screeched loudly as the train came to a stop. My stomach tightened with fear. This wasn't any station I recognized. At the far end of the car, the door slid open with a hiss. A blast of cold air hit me, carrying a damp, earthy smell. I froze, unable to move, as a figure stepped inside. It was the conductor, but something was terribly wrong. His uniform hung loosely on his thin frame, and his face looked sunken and pale. His eyes were hollow, empty pits, and his mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. "This is your stop," he said, his voice low and unnatural. "No," I whispered, shaking my head, my back pressed against the wall. "I'm not getting off." "You don't have a choice," he said, taking a step closer. The lights flickered, and for a second, his face was no longer human. It was a shifting, dark mass. Behind him, the passengers began to move. They stood up slowly, their movements stiff and jerky. Their eyes were empty, and their mouths hung open, like they were silently screaming. They shuffled toward me, arms outstretched. The conductor raised his hand, and the door behind him opened into the black void. "This is where you belong," he said. The shadows rushed at me, their cold hands grabbing my arms and pulling me toward the door. I screamed, kicking and struggling. But it was no use. The darkness pulled me in. The last thing I heard was the conductor's calm, chilling voice, "Welcome home." Then, everything went black. I woke up back in my seat, the train rattling along as if nothing had happened. My head felt heavy, thoughts foggy. I blinked, trying to focus, but everything around me seemed off. The passengers were still there, but something was different now. They weren't just sitting motionless, they were staring. Every face in the car was turned toward me, their hollow eyes unblinking. My heart raced as I looked down at my hands. They weren't mine anymore. My skin was pale and translucent, my veins dark and twisted beneath the surface. I pressed my hand to my chest, but there was nothing, no heartbeat, no warmth, just an empty, cold stillness. The whispers returned, but this time they weren't faint or distant. They were inside my head, weaving through my thoughts like threads of smoke. They weren't words, they were feelings: despair, anger, hopelessness. I clutched at my head, willing them to stop, but the train only seemed to amplify them. I glanced at the window, desperate for answers, but my reflection didn't move. It stared back at me with a twisted grin, its eyes dark and endless. My reflection leaned closer, its lips forming the words I couldn't bear to hear. You're one of us now. The train slowed, the sound of grinding metal filling the car. Outside, the void remained, endless and oppressive. But through the blackness, I saw them: shadows, hundreds of them, waiting just beyond the train. They pulsed and writhed like a living sea, their hollow eyes fixed on me. The conductor appeared at the far end of the car, his skeletal grin stretching wider. "This is the truth," he said, his voice calm and final. "You were never supposed to leave." I tried to scream, but no sound came. The passengers stood in unison, their movements jerky, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles. As the train stopped, the shadows surged forward, pulling me into the void. The last thing I saw was my reflection, still grinning in the window. Even as I disappeared into the darkness, I was no longer alive. I was part of the train. Forever. If you were the only one alive on a train full of the dead, how would you escape? Could you resist? The whispers, the shadows, the pull of the unknown. Share your survival plan. How would you make it out alive? If the train carried only the dead, but you were somehow aboard, how would you explain your presence? Would you fight for answers, or accept your place among the shadows? The book wasn't supposed to mean anything, just a quirky find at a dusty thrift store. But when I flipped to page 1, the instructions matched my life perfectly. Now, every chilling warning has come true, and I'm not sure I'll survive to finish reading. The book was strange from the moment I saw it. It didn't belong there, tucked between old romance novels and cookbooks in the dusty thrift store. Its black leather cover gleamed unnaturally under the dim overhead lights. No title on the spine, no author. Just the words stamped on the front in bold, golden letters: the last night of your life, a survival guide. I felt a shiver as I picked it up, the leather cold and smooth under my fingers. The weight of the book felt wrong, like it was heavier than it should have been. When I opened it, the first page greeted me with chilling clarity. This is not fiction. If you are reading this, tonight is your last night. Follow the rules if you want to survive. I laughed nervously, glancing around the store as if someone were watching. My unease deepened with every page I skimmed. The instructions weren't vague, they were disturbingly specific. The first rule read: at 8:07 p.m., a knock will come. Do not open the door. I checked my watch. 8:04 p.m. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. My pulse quickened as I glanced toward the store door, half expecting someone to burst through. A notification buzzed on my phone, making me jump. The screen read: missed delivery attempt at 8:07 p.m. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I looked back at the book, flipping to the next page. The words were sharper now, almost cutting into my mind. If you ignored the knock, good, but it will return stronger. Prepared. I snapped the book shut and rushed to the register, tossing cash at the clerk. His expression was unsettlingly neutral. Most people don't finish that one, he muttered, sliding the book into a bag. I didn't respond. The moment I stepped outside, the air felt heavier. My phone buzzed again, and when I looked down, the words on the screen sent a jolt through me: they're already here. When I got home, the first thing I did was lock the door. My heart hadn't stopped racing since I left the thrift store. The book sat on my kitchen table, its black cover gleaming like it knew something I didn't. Didn't want to open it again, but the buzzing tension in my chest forced me to. I had to know what came next. The page where I'd left off had new words on it. I hadn't noticed them before. At 8:07 p.m. A knock will come. Do not open the door. I checked the clock. 8:05 p.m. My stomach dropped. The warning wasn't some generic what if it was. Exact, precise. My watch ticked louder in my ears, each second pulling me closer to the moment. At 8:07, the knock came. It wasn't a casual knock. It was slow, deliberate 3 solid raps that sent shivers down my spine. Froze, clutching the book. My hands were slick with sweat as I reread the words, "Do not open the door." The knocking continued, louder this time. My throat tightened as I stared at the door. Shadows moved, under the frame, unnatural and twisting. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from crying out. The knocking stopped, replaced by silence. For a second, I thought it was over. But then, my phone buzzed on the table. I grabbed it, hands shaking. The notification read, "They're still outside." I flipped to the next page. The words seemed to glow against the paper if you ignored the knock. Good, but they'll come back stronger. Be prepared. The silence stretched, pressing against my ears like a scream. Then, the doorknob turned. I stared in horror as it twisted back and forth, rattling violently. The sound echoed through the house. My breath hitched, and the book's next line seared itself into my brain, "You're running out of time." I didn't know what would happen if the door opened, but I knew one thing: I couldn't face what was waiting on the other side. The rattling of the doorknob stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It pressed against my ears, heavy and suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I clutched the book tighter, flipping to the next page with trembling hands. The words were written in bold, commanding urgency at 8:23 p.m. The lights will flicker. Count to 10. If they come back on, stay where you are. If they don't, run. I glanced at the clock. 8:21 p.m. My pulse quickened. I stayed rooted in place, gripping the table for support as I stared at the overhead light, willing it to stay steady. Each tick of the second hand was like a hammer to my chest. Then it happened. At exactly 8:23, the light flickered. The shadows in the room stretched and twisted with each flash, bending unnaturally. My breath caught as I began to count aloud, my voice shaking. 1, 2, 3. The flickering grew erratic, plunging the room into bursts of near-complete darkness. 4, 5, 6. A low hum filled the air, like static buzzing just beneath my hearing. 7, 8. My voice faltered as the light dimmed completely. My hands fumbled for my phone, the glowing screen barely cutting through the blackness. 9, 10. The light snapped back on, steady and blinding. I collapsed against the table, gasping for breath. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. The book was waiting, its next instruction written in a sinister scrawl: "Do not look out the windows after 8:30 p.m. They'll be watching." The clock ticked closer to 8:30. I bolted to the windows, yanking the curtains closed with shaking hands. But as I turned away, I heard a soft tapping on the glass. My blood ran cold as the tapping grew louder, more insistent, moving from one window to the next. Shadows flickered at the edges of the curtains, long and spindly, stretching toward the floor. I didn't dare move, my breath shallow as the book's next page revealed a chilling promise: "They're not going away." Eerie. The tapping stopped suddenly, leaving an oppressive silence that was somehow worse. I stayed frozen, my back pressed against the wall, clutching the book as if it were the only thing keeping me alive. My eyes darted to the clock. It was 9:55 p.m. The last test was coming. I flipped the page with trembling fingers. The text was bold, screaming at me from the paper. At 10 p.m. the door will open. Do not step outside unless you hear your name. I stared at the words, my pulse thundering in my ears. The door. It had already rattled earlier, but this time, it was going to open. My breathing quickened as I read the next line: "They will call for you." They will sound familiar, but it isn't them. Don't trust the voice. The clock ticked closer to 10 p.m. The seconds dragged, each one carving into my sanity. My legs felt weak, and I slid down to the floor, pressing myself into the corner. My phone buzzed, the screen flashing. A notification 10 p.m. It's time. The door creaked open with an agonizing slowness, the sound echoing through the room. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it faint whispers that grew louder and more insistent. Then I heard my mother's voice. "It's okay, sweetheart," it called. "Come outside. I'm here. You're safe." Tears welled up in my eyes. It sounded so real, so warm. But the book's warning blazed in my mind. It isn't them. My name echoed again, this time from my best friend. "We've been looking for you. Come on, it's safe." I clamped my hands over my ears, shaking my head violently. The whispers became screams, dozens of voices overlapping, pleading for me to step outside. Shadows swirled around the open door, stretching into the room like clawed hands. The clock struck 10:01. The door slammed shut on its own. The whispers stopped. I opened my eyes, trembling, and turned the page. The words stared back at me. "You've passed the test, but you're not safe yet." The door's slam left the room eerily silent. My body shook as I clutched the book tighter, its weight feeling heavier, colder, as if it were draining the strength from my hands. The clock read 10:15 p.m. Wasn't safe yet, something was still coming. I flipped to the next page. The text was different now, scrawled and uneven as if written in desperation. "The house is no longer yours. It belongs to them. You have until 11 p.m. to leave." Leave? Go where? The thought sent a chill through me. My home was the only place I had ever felt safe. But now the walls themselves seemed to close in, the air thick with dread. A low creak echoed from upstairs, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. My legs felt frozen, but my mind screamed at me to move. The next line of the book burned in my mind. "Do not look back. Do not stop. Do not speak to them." With trembling hands, I grabbed my coat and phone. I opened the door a crack, peering into the hallway. Shadows stretched unnaturally long under the flickering overhead light, shifting like they were alive. My breath hitched, and I stepped out, the floor creaking under my weight. Behind me, the dragging sound grew louder, closer. I fought the urge to look back, forcing my legs to keep moving. The front door loomed ahead, a thin line of darkness visible through its edges. Every instinct told me to run, but I knew the shadows would sense my panic. The air grew colder as I reached the door. My fingers fumbled with the lock, shaking so hard I could barely grip it. The dragging sound stopped. Silence. For one horrible moment, I thought I'd imagined it all. Then came a whisper, right behind me, "Leaving so soon." I froze, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out all thought. Slowly, I unlocked the door, ignoring the shadow stretching over my shoulder. I didn't turn, didn't speak. The cold air outside rushed against my face as I stumbled out onto the porch. The house behind me groaned as if alive, its windows glowing faintly with an unnatural light. I turned the page of the book, the final words chilling me to my core. "You escaped, but it's not over. They'll follow." The book dissolved into ash in my hands. Behind me, the door opened once more. What would you do if you found a book predicting your last night on Earth? Could you follow the rules, or would fear drive you to break them? Share your thoughts. How would you survive? If a survival guide predicted every moment of your doom, would you follow its warnings or risk breaking the rules? Could you handle knowing your fate?